Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Week in Sustainability. I am Melissa Raid, Chief Sustainability Officer of Sustain Life, and I'm here with some practitioners from our sustainability team at Sustain Life, here to talk to you about what's going on in the news today, interesting hot tips from the world of sustainability. And today we're actually going to be introducing two topics. We're taking you to school. We're talking about some new studies that have been released on renewable cost forecasting and on the Falcon curve, and the electrification impacts on the grid. So before we dive into those, let's have my colleagues introduce themselves. Nick, Constance, please take it away.
I am Nick Lusantag. I'm Senior Manager for Sustainability.
Hi, I'm Constance Duke, and I'm the Director of Sustainability and manage our technical practice.
All right, cool. So let's kick it off. There was a new study that spoke about grounding some forecasts of technology and the energy transition as related to the IRA. So who can break this down for us? Take us to school, if you will.
We can break it down a little bit. So basically, this paper came out last month from a few economists at Oxford University, and they're basically just trying to project out the cost of renewables over time. And when I say renewables, I mean like all clean energy technologies. And when we're talking cost, we mean the cost to install it, like the cost of a solar panel, of a wind turbine, not the cost to purchase the energy. So they're projecting out the cost to basically, ramp up renewable production over time. And their modeling is based on this idea that we're all familiar with, which is that the more you make of something, the cheaper it becomes. And that's because of economies of scale, but also because as you do something more, you become better at it. You benefit from your experience. And so you learn to do it faster and more cheaply, and the cost comes down. So they're really
Mhm.
looking at okay, if we rapidly deploy renewables, how much will the cost fall? This is important because we want to know how much the costs will fall so we, can make proper decisions. It's also important because previous models that we have from the IPCC and IEA have um, poorly projected out the cost of renewables. So, as an example, over the last 10 years, the cost of solar dropped by 90%. Our existing models thought it would drop by like 25%. So they were way off.
Wow.
This new model is extremely accurate, and actually, had we had it at a time, would have predicted that drop in solar. So go ahead, Alyssa, you're gonna ask a
Well,
question.
I was going to ask two questions. So the first one is, was this model in any part built retroactively, like off of those findings, knowing how much solar has dropped over time? Was it actually using the observed data points to impact,
So
the
yeah,
formula of the
I don't
model?
exactly know how they sort of did the backcasting, but I
Hmm.
do know based on like an interview I listened to with the authors that there was a chunk of a period of time that the model had never seen, and it fairly accurately predicted it. So they did hold back some data for testing. Um,
Okay,
yeah.
interesting. So um, the other question was, so there's another article that was posted in the Atlantic um, just earlier this month, and that was talking about um, basically just how much the cost of clean energy in the United States is going to drop, and how it could, because of certain provisions and incentives provided in the IRA. I think they had it at as less than $5 a megawatt hours, which would make it the cheapest renewable energy in the world. And so, is that article and study based off of this model?
Uh, I I don't think so. I think they're actually separate because this modeling was actually done before the IRA came out. Or they
Mm,
actually really did most of their modeling last year. Um, but I'll get to, sort of the tie-in with the IRA and like what it really means towards the end. Um, what did they find though? Why is this important? So they created a super accurate model. What does it mean? Basically, they're arguing in their paper that we are on the cusp of extremely cheap renewable energy, and that the faster we ramp up production, the faster we see those costs fall. And so, the slower we do it, we're kind of missing an opportunity for for economic savings. They put together a few scenarios in their paper. They put together a fast transition scenario, which basically gets us to net zero by 2050, which is what we want. And over those 25 years, that scenario saved $12 trillion. And that was including the cost to build out all of the infrastructure, build out the grid. That wasn't just the costs of the renewables themselves, it was all the ancillary costs that come with it. And so they're really arguing that this is like just good business practice or good economic practice, regardless of the climate benefits, or rather, in addition to the climate benefits and the
Mm-hmm.
air pollution benefits and the public health benefits and all of that. We should be doing this regardless. Um, if we care about fiscal responsibility and things like
Mm-hmm.
that. So really, really exciting stuff. And basically it's just illustrating this feedback loop between, the more renewables we make
Mm-hmm.
and how much the costs will fall.
Yep.
The
I
the
mean,
time, yeah, go ahead.
it just like totally makes sense when you think of positive feedback loops. Like that's how
Yeah,
these things work, right? It's not like a linear one for one. It's like invest in this and it's going to grow in the next round that much more than had you, invested half of that.
totally. And the models we had before used this approach, but it was only one of the sort of submodels that they were using, and they also constrained it a lot because they wanted it to be conservative. And the authors here haven't done that. They've just let
Mm-hmm.
the model run and see what it says, and it turns out to be pretty accurate, and they think it's reliable. So the tie-in with the IRA, when the Inflation Reduction Act came out, we were talking about how it does a lot of great things, um, but at the same time, it's not quite enough. Like it can't be the only thing. And while I think we absolutely need to do more, modeling like this suggests that that act can sort of become greater than the sum of its parts. If it can drive down costs to $5 per megawatt hour, cheapest in the world, then that kind of can trigger the feedback loop of, okay, it's super cheap. A lot more people want to do it. We're going to make a lot more. It's going to get even cheaper.
Mm-hmm.
So really exciting stuff, really optimistic paper, and the author's really banging the table that like we need to get on this,
Yeah.
like there's money on the table.
Yes. And speaking of time being of the essence and that money on the table, my somewhat skeptical question, not to damper the optimism in the room, but is if we do delay, which we have a habit of doing, does that, we know we're losing money, but does the model suggest that like if we delay or slow our pace to a certain rate that like these benefits actually won't come to be at all? Like it won't show itself to be as advantageous.
um it's more that it'll just take longer for us to really see the benefits.
Mhm.
But the way the modeling works is that it's not quite an exponential curve, it's a power curve. So basically means the more we do of it, we get a disproportionately greater amount of savings.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, whether we do it we ramp up in 10 years or 30 years, from an economic perspective, from cost perspective, doesn't make much of a difference. But obviously, from a climate perspective, it does. And,
Mhm.
we want to start saving money faster.
Yeah. Yes. Right. For more total money saved overall. You're not saving money for those first 5, 10 years just because ramp up was so slow. You're missing the boat here.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. I do think it's also important to kind of note that there wasn't any bad intention behind the previous models that were incorrect. So like we know that the IPCC has traditionally taken a much more conservative approach, even on how they model climate change impacts. And, while of course still being called alarmist, but there is also a project out of the UK, it's the Economics of Energy Innovation and System Transition, that kind of looked into why these previous models were inaccurate. And it's really interesting. There are numerous challenges around just traditional cost benefit analysis. And, the difficulty in predicting things that are inherently unpredictable, like innovation or spillover technology or global policy development, which we're seeing
Mhm.
a lot of recently. Um, And they also mention the quantitative fallacy, which essentially gives more weight to what can be counted than to what may count, like qualitative considerations. And the example that it made me think of right away is the energy transition in Germany. It's called Energiewende, where the use of solar power, when they first came out with it, it was largely symbolic. There was no major cost benefit to deploying large scale solar energy, and now they're a leader in solar power generation. So this is just to say that the modeling errors are understandable. They have been looked into. It's unfortunate that they resulted in kind of a slowdown of adoption of renewable energy tech, but fortunately now we have studies like this coming out that are putting us on the right track, hopefully.
That is super interesting. Okay, cool. All right, let's move on to our next study, the Falcon curve, and talking about the impacts of electrification on the grid.
Yeah, so the Falcon curve came out of a recent study out of the Harvard School of Public Health and talks about how electrification will impact the grid. And intuitively, we already know how this will work, but quantitatively, it's really only been assessed for how much we have to ramp up renewable energy production throughout the year. And they took a little bit of a different approach and said, how does it impact the grid month over month? What are the seasonal variations?
Mm-hmm.
And so as you would expect with the U.S. climate, that in the winter time we use a ton of heating energy. So if we electrify it, then obviously the demand on the grid would increase quite dramatically. And then we also have this little bump in the summertime in the middle of the year where people obviously use their ACs. So when you put that into an illustration, it looks like a falcon in flight where you have, the wings and then the little head in the center. Thank you, Nick, for that visualization. And so it's intuitive, but it's new in terms of the quantification. And they came out with really interesting figures like that in January, we'd have to ramp up wind energy generation by 28 times or solar energy generation by 303 times. So it's such a drastic ramp up of
Mm.
renewable electricity generation. Um, and then they also quantified by how many terawatt hours we can reduce that seasonal demand under various efficiency scenarios to start flattening that curve so we're
Mm-hmm.
not basically blowing up the grid. Um, so I thought this was pretty interesting. We talked a little bit about the Falcon curve being the new duck curve. And for anyone who doesn't remember that, it's a few years old, but the duck curve was a curve in the shape of a duck and essentially um, illustrated the instability on the grid from deploying solar energy and feeding solar energy into the grid during various hours of the day. And we know how to address this through microgrids, through energy storage, and so on. But yeah, the Falcon curve is the new duck curve that we now have to solve for too.
Yeah, I think what's interesting about the Falcon curve is it really highlights technology choice and how that's going to impact how dramatic that new wintertime peak will be. So I think they said that if we replace all of our fossil fuel heating with resistive heating, which is the least efficient kind of heating, it's basically what your toaster does. It just runs a current through a piece of metal that heats up. Then that new wintertime peak would be about double what the current summertime peak is. So we're talking a
Mm-hmm.
lot more energy, a lot more renewable energy, a lot more storage. If we use air source heat pumps, which is generally what we mean when we talk about heat pumps, it's a heat pump that pulls heat out of the air. So even when it's 15 degrees outside, it's able to suck heat out of the outdoor air and bring it into your home. Then that wintertime peak is about 50% higher than the current summertime peak. So not as crazy, but
Mm-hmm.
probably within the realm of possibility of achieving, but still a lot. There are a few technologies though that kind of play really well into a wintertime peak. One is geothermal heat pumps. So instead of pulling heat from the air, a geothermal heat pump actually pulls it out of the ground. the ground, even in the depths of winter, is still like 55 degrees. So there's a lot more heat to be pulled out. And they're much more efficient than an air source heat pump in the middle of winter. So um, that curve would drop even further if we use a lot of geothermal. And then another thing which gets talked about less, I think, but seasonal energy storage. Usually when we talk about energy storage, we're talking about like daily storage. We're storing energy from the daytime from solar or something, and we're using it at night. That's where the duck curve comes into play. But seasonal energy storage, we actually want to store energy from the summertime, from excess solar energy that's produced in the middle of August, and store it until the wintertime. And so there's a few technologies there that play really well for long-term energy storage. One is pumped hydro, which we already do a lot. So when you have excess energy, you pump it to the top of a mountain or top of a hill. Then in the wintertime, when you need that electricity back, you just release it and it runs a generator. So it's basically a hydroelectric dam at that point.
Yep.
And then a couple other ones, geomechanical storage, which I think is super interesting. Basically similar to pumped hydro, but you're pumping a fluid into the ground, into rock deposits that compress those rocks, and then you cap it. And when you need electricity, you release the cap and the pressure releases and you run a generator. So there's already a few. I know there's a pilot in upstate New York from a company called QuidNet that's going in or has already gone in. And then the last thing is hydrogen. So hydrogen fuel cells, you take hydrogen and oxygen and out you get electricity and water. The problem is hydrogen takes a lot of energy to create, but if you can create it with excess renewables in the summertime, store that hydrogen, and then run it through a fuel cell in the wintertime, that's a good way of storing energy. So yeah, some interesting, technological implications from this paper.
That is very cool. But I mean, some of these technologies are just incredible. And to think about them being deployed like in mass scale and tying it into our first study and thinking about the increasing economic value of investing in these technologies today to further drive down their price. Like this is where it all links together. These like some of those technologies I imagine are still expensive. If there's a pilot going in New York for the geomechanical, like that, it's got to still be relatively expensive. But the more you invest in it today, the quicker it'll drive down its price, as we're shown, a little bit in that previous study.
Yeah, I'm really excited that we're finally seriously talking about geothermal heating systems. It seems like such a sustainable, common sense thing to do that we should have just invested into large scale systems a long time ago. And it's also really interesting to get into the details of some of these systems, open loop versus closed loop, and then kind of the challenges each has. If you have open loop, you're just running water through it, and then you have sediment deposits. How do you do the maintenance of that? Versus, if you use a closed loop system and you're running antifreeze through there, it's not as efficient as the open loop system. But I was really impressed to see some of the coefficients of performance. I mean, as high as 6, which is really, really high when you're talking about efficiency. So, just your average AC runs between 2.3 to 3.5, and that's considered pretty efficient. So anything above 2 would be pretty efficient. So if we're talking about, COPs of 6, that is higher than anything that we've seen with current technology. So very exciting.
Yeah, and for anyone that doesn't know, a COP of 6 means that it's 600% efficient. So for every, 1 unit or every 1 unit of energy sorry, I'm getting it reversed. For every 1 unit of energy that it consumes, it moves 6 units of energy. And yeah, six is really high. I mean, 3 to 4 is pretty good. So yeah, exciting stuff for sure.
Very cool. And I also, just while we're breaking things down for viewers, and we probably should have done this in the beginning, but we spoke about flattening the curve between those seasonal swings as we move towards electrifying the grid. Can we just back it up for a second and explain to everybody why is it important to flatten the curve? I feel like in every system, you were always saying, we got to flatten the curve. I mean, not to make any COVID jokes, but when COVID came out, it was all about flattening the curve, right? About stabilizing those peaks. So why is that important when we think of power generation and distribution?
Well, I would say one reason is economically. So if you're putting more and more renewables on the grid, then some of those renewables will only be used for the peaks of electric demand. And so your economic return is reduced, is lower because there's just fewer hours in the year where your electricity is valuable. Because if you're only serving the peaks, then um, you may not be required for those troughs.
Mhm.
And then the other reason is that renewables are not dispatchable or not as dispatchable as, things like fossil fuels. We can't necessarily control when the sun shines or when the wind blows. And this is where energy storage plays a part because we can store it. But by flattening the peaks, we need less energy storage, which makes it overall cheaper to serve those peaks.
If we don't flatten that curve, then we're just going to have to rely on fossil fuels longer because we can't do that ramp up to 303 times the amount of solar energy that we're producing now just to produce it in January.
Mhm.
So inevitably, it would just mean we would be relying on fossil fuels.
Yep, yep, which is a really important premise that I think it's important for everybody to kind of grasp and understand. Like, we can get so deep into these studies and economics and the impact, but at a very high level, that's why flattening the curve is so critically important, because that's really what we need to do to get off our reliance on fossil fuels and just kind of reach the equilibrium through renewable sources and not feel so much pressure, from these very disparate peaks.
We're shooting for a gliding falcon curve.
It all comes back to the falcon. That is great. Okay, well, that is what we have for you this week. Thank you all for joining this week in sustainability. We will see you next week for more hot topics and sustainable news.
Bye, folks.